For more than half a century, the world has operated on one simple, unspoken assumption. America is the global empire. Its military is unmatched, its technology sets the pace, and its culture dominates every screen. But have you ever truly asked why? How did a single nation, in such a short period, come to dominate the entire planet so completely? The answer is not its aircraft carriers, nor is it Hollywood. The true source of American power, its single most potent weapon, is the US dollar. The dollar is not just money, it is a system of control. It is the invisible force that has allowed America to project its power, fund its wars, and essentially rule the world. This status, the world reserve currency, was not an accident. It was not won in a fair fight. It was engineered. It was sealed in a secret deal, a $50 trillion handshake in the dark that subjugated the global economy to America's will. And now, after 50 years of silent dominance, that handshake is breaking. The pillars of the empire are cracking. The very nations that agreed to this secret pact are now actively defecting, dismantling the system from the inside out. This is the story of the petrodollar. It is the greatest secret of modern economic history. It is the story of how the American empire was truly built, and how, right now, in 2025, we are witnessing its spectacular and terrifying collapse. To understand the crisis that is unfolding today, you cannot begin with today's news. You must go back. You must go back to the end of the Second World War, to a small hotel in New Hampshire, where the architects of the modern world gathered to decide the fate of the global economy. In 1944, with Europe and Asia in ashes, delegates from 44 allied nations met at Bretton Woods. Their goal was to create a new, stable financial system that would prevent the kind of economic chaos that had led to the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. The world needed a leader, an anchor. The United States was the only candidate. It was the only major industrial nation untouched by the ravages of war. And more importantly, it held over 2/3 of the entire world's gold reserves, sitting securely in its vaults. It was here that America made its golden promise. The world's currencies, which were shattered, would no longer be redeemable for gold. Instead, they would be pegged to the US dollar. And the US dollar, in turn, would be pegged to gold, at a fixed, guaranteed rate of $35 for 1 ounce of gold. This was the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was a brilliant move. The US dollar became the official world reserve currency, the center of the financial universe, because it was, quite literally, as good as gold. Any nation, at any time, could show up at the US Treasury and exchange their dollars for physical, tangible gold. This promise was the bedrock of global confidence. It was the foundation of the entire post-war boom. It was also a promise that America had absolutely no intention of keeping. The problem with a gold standard is that it is a golden handcuff. It enforces discipline. A government cannot print more money than it has gold to back it up. But in the 1960s, the United States government desperately wanted to spend. It found itself fighting 2 massive expensive wars at the same time. One was a very hot war in the jungles of Vietnam. The other was a domestic war, the war on poverty. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program. Both were colossally expensive. To pay for the bombs and the welfare, the US government did what all governments do. It printed money. It began flooding the world with billions of new paper dollars, but the world was not stupid. Other nations, particularly France, led by the astute Charles de Gaulle, saw what was happening. They looked at the mountains of paper dollars they held, and they looked at the official US gold reserves, and they did the math. They realized America was printing far more dollars than it had gold in its vaults. The dollar was a lie. De Gaulle, in a famous press conference, denounced the US for its exorbitant privilege of being able to pay for its deficits with money it simply printed. He called America's bluff. He began sending warships to New York Harbor, not to attack but to load up with the gold he was owed. He was demanding America make good on its 1944 promise, and other nations quickly followed. Spain, Germany, Switzerland, all began to line up, demanding their gold back. This was a catastrophic bank run on the US Treasury. The golden handcuff was choking the American empire. The country was bleeding gold. The vaults were emptying. President Richard Nixon was cornered. He was facing an impossible choice. Either stop all his spending, admit to the world that America was broke, and trigger a second Great Depression, or he could cheat. He chose to cheat. On the night of August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon went on national television and delivered what is now known as the Nixon Shock. He announced that he was temporarily closing the gold window. He was severing the link between the US dollar and gold. He looked the entire world in the eye and defaulted on the golden promise. This single act should have been the end of the American empire. The US dollar, the world reserve currency, was now officially backed by nothing. It was a fiat currency, a piece of paper whose value was based on only one thing: the full faith and credit of the very government that had just broken its most sacred financial promise. By all laws of economics, the dollar should have collapsed. A global panic should have ensued as every nation on earth dumped their now worthless paper dollars, triggering hyperinflation in the United States. But it didn't happen. Why? Because the US government, led by the cunning Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, had a backup plan. A plan so brilliant and so sinister that it would replace the golden handcuff with something far more powerful, an oil-powered shackle. Just as the world was realizing the dollar was backed by nothing, a new crisis conveniently emerged. In 1973, the OPEC nations, led by Saudi Arabia, announced an oil embargo against the United States in retaliation for its support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The price of oil quadrupled overnight. Gas lines stretched for miles. The global economy, which runs on oil, was plunged into a recession. It was chaos. But Henry Kissinger saw an opportunity. He saw a new way to re-anchor the dollar. He flew to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, for a series of secret high-stakes meetings with King Faisal. This is where the $50 trillion handshake took place. The deal was a simple, brutal stroke of geopolitical genius. It was a deal of protection for profit. The United States, the world's preeminent military power, made Saudi Arabia an offer it could not refuse. The US would provide the Saudi royal family with complete, unconditional military protection. They would sell them their most advanced weapons, shield them from their regional enemies like Iran and Iraq, and guarantee the survival of their kingdom. In exchange, Saudi Arabia had to do one simple thing. They had to agree to sell all of their oil, every single barrel, only in US dollars. This was the masterstroke. Kissinger did not stop there. The US then used Saudi Arabia's leadership role in OPEC to pressure all other major oil-producing nations, Kuwait, the UAE, Nigeria, Venezuela, to adopt the same policy. By 1975, the petrodollar system was born. The US dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by black gold. It was backed by oil. Think for a moment about the genius of this trap. Every single industrial nation on earth, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, South Korea, needs oil to run its factories, heat its homes, and fuel its cars. And to buy that oil from any major OPEC producer, they must first go onto the open market and purchase US dollars. This created a massive, permanent, and completely artificial global demand for American currency. It no longer mattered that the dollar was fiat. It no longer mattered if the US was printing trillions of dollars to fund its deficits. The rest of the world was forced to soak up those dollars, to hold them in their central banks as reserves just to be able to buy the energy they needed to survive. This is the system that truly built the American empire. It is the exorbitant privilege that Charles de Gaulle had warned about, now on steroids. It allowed America to become the only country in history that could buy anything it wanted by simply printing the money for it. It could fund the world's largest military, run trillion-dollar trade deficits year after year, and export its inflation to the rest of the world. As long as the world needed oil, the world needed dollars. The petrodollar system was the ultimate economic weapon. And for 50 years, it was an unbreakable chain. Until now, today, in 2025, that chain is breaking. The $50 trillion handshake is over. The very foundation of the American empire is crumbling, and it is crumbling because the world has changed. The protection for profit deal has gone sour. First, the challengers. Two major powers have emerged that are openly hostile to the petrodollar system. Russia, a massive energy exporter, has been kicked out of the dollar system by US sanctions. And China, which has become the world's largest importer of oil, is no longer willing to have its energy security held hostage by the currency of its main economic rival. These two nations have united with a single goal: to break the dollar's monopoly. This is the de-dollarization movement. The evidence is no longer a conspiracy theory. It is happening in plain sight. China is now systematically bypassing the dollar. It is buying oil from Russia, in Chinese yuan. It is building pipelines to Iran, and buying its oil in yuan. India, another rising giant, is buying billions of dollars in oil from Russia, in its own currency, the rupee. The system is being bypassed, but the final, fatal blow is coming from the original partner, Saudi Arabia itself, the linchpin of the entire system. For 50 years, the Saudis upheld the deal because they needed US military protection. But in the last decade, they have watched America's chaotic foreign policy and decided their protector is no longer reliable. They are making new friends. And in 2024, the most significant event of our financial lifetime occurred, and it barely made the news. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS, the rival economic alliance led by China and Russia, whose stated goal is to create a new global currency to replace the dollar. The handshake is broken. The protection part of the deal is in question, so the profit part is off the table. In 2024 and 2025, Saudi officials have, for the first time, openly stated that they are open to selling their oil and other currencies, including the Chinese yuan. The original deal is dead. So what happens now? What happens when the reason for holding dollars disappears? What happens when Japan and Germany and France can buy their oil directly with yuan or rupees or any other currency? They no longer need to hold trillions of USD dollars in their reserves. And all of those dollars, trillions upon trillions of paper notes that America has printed for 50 years to pay for its deficits, all of those dollars begin to come home. A tsunami of paper, a tidal wave of fiat currency, floods back to the United States. The result is not just inflation, it is hyperinflation. It is the catastrophic final devaluation of the dollar. It is the moment the exorbitant privilege ends, and the bill for 50 years of living on credit finally comes due. The collapse of the petrodollar system is not a risk, it is not a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty that is already in motion. The $50 trillion handshake built the greatest, most powerful empire the world has ever known, and its breaking will trigger the single greatest economic realignment and collapse of our lifetime.